America did not begin as a dream of freedom, democracy, or destiny. It began with a mathematical error. In 1492, Christopher Columbus was convinced the Earth was much smaller than it actually is. He believed that sailing west from Europe would take him directly to Asia. His goal was not discovery. It was profit, spices, trade routes, and wealth controlled by European kings. Columbus was wrong about the size of the planet, but he was stubborn enough to act on that mistake. When he reached land in the Caribbean, he believed he had arrived at islands near Asia. He never accepted that he had encountered something entirely new. Until his death, Columbus insisted he had reached the edge of the known world. This misunderstanding mattered, because Columbus didn't just misjudge geography, he misidentified an entire continent. And that mistake shaped how Europe treated the land and the people who lived there. Spain did not care that Columbus was wrong. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella cared about results. They wanted wealth, power, and religious influence. Columbus returned to Spain with stories of fertile land, unfamiliar people, and hints of gold. That was enough. Spain sent more expeditions. And when Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico in 1519, everything changed. Cortés encountered the Aztec Empire, ruled by Emperor Montezuma II. It was not a scattered tribal society. It was a powerful, organized civilization with cities, armies, and wealth. Through alliances with rival tribes, deliberate deception, and the unintended devastation of European diseases, Cortés destroyed the Aztec Empire in just a few years. A decade later, Francisco Pizarro repeated the pattern in South America, capturing and executing the Inca Emperor Atahualpa and dismantling another vast empire. Gold and silver poured into Spain. Spain became the richest empire the world had ever seen, almost overnight. But this wealth came from Central and South America, not from the lands that would one day become the United States. North America offered no massive cities like Tenochtitlan, no centralized empires to conquer, no immediate treasure to seize. Instead, it was vast, forested, cold, and sparsely populated by European standards. To Spain, North America looked unprofitable. So Spain focused south, building cities, extracting wealth, and enforcing control across Mexico, Central America, and much of South America. North America was left mostly untouched. Portugal, meanwhile, took a completely different path. Under the influence of Prince Henry the Navigator, Portuguese sailors had already begun exploring the African coastline decades before Columbus sailed. By the early 1500s, Portuguese explorers had discovered a sea route around Africa to India and Asia. Portugal built an empire of ports, ships, and trade routes. They did not need large colonies. They needed access. Spain conquered land. Portugal controlled commerce. And North America remained outside both strategies. England noticed North America early. In 1497, John Cabot explored its coastline under the English flag. England now had a claim, at least on paper. But England was distracted. Religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants tore the country apart. Internal power struggles weakened the monarchy. And England faced a growing rivalry with Spain, the dominant global power of the era. Colonization required money, stability, and patience, none of which England had in abundance. When England finally attempted to settle North America, the effort nearly collapsed completely. In 1587, a group of English settlers led by John White established a colony on Roanoke Island, off the coast of present-day North Carolina. White returned to England for supplies. When he came back years later, the colony had vanished. No bodies, no signs of battle, no clear explanation. Only one word carved into a tree: Croton. The disappearance became one of history's great mysteries and a warning to future settlers. England tried again. In 1607, Jamestown was founded in Virginia. The site was poorly chosen. The settlers were unprepared. Disease spread quickly. Food ran out. Leadership collapsed. At one point, the situation became so desperate that settlers resorted to cannibalism to survive the winter. The colony came dangerously close to total failure. One man, John Smith, imposed discipline and order. He forced settlers to work, negotiated trade with local tribes, and kept Jamestown alive through a combination of authority and adaptability. Without Smith, Jamestown would likely have failed, and English colonization of North America might have ended entirely. But Jamestown survived. Then came a different kind of settler. In 1620, a group of religious separatists led by William Bradford landed at Plymouth. These were not soldiers or treasure hunters. They were families fleeing religious persecution in England. Their society was strict and deeply religious. Gambling was banned. Dissent was punished. Even celebrating Christmas was considered sinful. The first winter was brutal. Many died from disease and starvation. But the colony survived. And something unexpected began to happen. People kept coming. Not because of gold, but because of land. Farmers seeking opportunity. Religious minorities seeking freedom. Merchants seeking trade. Unlike Spanish colonies built on conquest, English colonies began filling with families. Population grew naturally. Communities formed. Farms expanded. By the early 1700s, British settlements stretched along the eastern coastline of North America. Towns like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia grew into major centers of commerce and culture. A new society was forming, one that did not exist anywhere else in the world. Not yet a nation, but no longer just a collection of outposts. And at this moment, before anyone realized it, the foundation of the United States had already been laid. By the middle of the 18th century, the British colonies in North America were no longer fragile experiments. They were growing, prosperous, and increasingly important, and that made them dangerous. What followed did not begin as a fight for independence. It began as a global war between empires. Britain and France have been rivals for centuries, fighting over territory, trade routes, and influence across Europe, Africa, and Asia. North America was just one front in a much larger struggle, but it would become one of the most decisive. France controlled a vast interior empire known as New France, stretching from Quebec down the St. Lawrence River through the Great Lakes and along the Mississippi River Valley to Louisiana. British colonies, meanwhile, were packed tightly along the Atlantic coast, hemmed in by mountains and expanding westward. The collision was inevitable. In 1754, a 22-year-old British officer named George Washington was sent into the Ohio Valley, a strategically vital region claimed by both empires. Washington confronted French troops near Fort Duquesne, close to present-day Pittsburgh. Shots were fired. Several men were killed. A global war began. In North America, the conflict became known as the French and Indian War, named after Britain's two primary enemies, France and its Native American allies. In Europe, it was called the 7 Years' War because it spread across multiple continents and involved nearly every major power of the time. France relied heavily on alliances with Native American nations such as the Huron, Algonquin, and Ojibwe, who understood the terrain and could strike quickly. Britain relied on numbers. By this point, the British colonies had over 1 million settlers, compared to France's roughly 60,000 in North America. Early on, Britain struggled. In 1755, British General Edward Braddock was killed in a disastrous ambush near Fort Duquesne. Colonial militias were disorganized, undertrained, and poorly supplied. The tide began to turn only after William Pitt the Elder, Britain's Secretary of State, poured money, troops, and naval power into the war. In 1759, British forces captured Quebec after the famous Battle of the Plains of Abraham, where General James Wolfe defeated French commander Louis-Joseph de Montcalm. Both generals died from their wounds. By 1763, the war was over. France lost nearly all of its North American possessions. Canada became British territory. Spain, which had allied with France, lost Florida to Britain. Britain now controlled more land in North America than any other European power. Britain had won, and Britain was bankrupt. The war had doubled Britain's national debt. British leaders believed the colonies should help pay for the war that had protected them. The colonists did not agree. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, placing direct taxes on newspapers, legal documents, and printed materials. Colonists erupted in protest. The act was repealed, but Parliament did not back down. In 1767, the Townshend Act imposed new taxes on glass, paint, paper, lead, and tea. British officials insisted Parliament had full authority over the colonies. Colonists argued otherwise. They claimed that taxation without representation violated their rights as Englishmen. No taxation without representation became a rallying cry across the colonies. From Boston to Charleston, tensions escalated. British troops were stationed in Boston to enforce order. The occupation bred resentment. On March 5, 1770, a confrontation between soldiers and civilians turned deadly. Shots were fired. 5 colonists were killed. The incident became known as the Boston Massacre. Colonial leaders like Samuel Adams used the event as propaganda, portraying British soldiers as tyrants occupying American streets. For a brief moment, tensions eased. Then Parliament made another mistake. In 1773, the Tea Act granted the British East India Company exclusive rights to sell tea in the colonies. The tax on tea was small, but the principle was not. Colonists saw it as an attempt to force acceptance of Parliament's authority. In response, on December 16, 1773, men disguised as Native Americans boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party shocked Britain. Parliament responded with force. In 1774, it passed a series of punitive laws known in Britain as the Coercive Acts and in America as the Intolerable Acts. Boston's port was closed. Massachusetts self-government was stripped away. British control tightened. Rather than isolating Massachusetts, these actions united the colonies. In September 1774, colonial leaders met in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress. Figures like John Adams, Patrick Henry, and George Washington debated how to respond. They still did not call for independence. Most hoped for reconciliation, but events overtook them. On April 19, 1775, British troops marched from Boston toward the towns of Lexington and Concord to seize colonial weapons. Local militias confronted them. Shots were fired. No one knows who fired first. But by the end of the day, the British were retreating back to Boston under constant attack. The American Revolutionary War had begun. By this point, the colonies had crossed a line they could not uncross. They had fought Britain's war. They had helped Britain win. And now they were being treated not as partners, but as subjects. By the end of Act Two, the question was no longer whether conflict could be avoided. The question was whether the colonies would survive what they had just started. What began as protest is about to become something far more dangerous. The colonies are about to gamble everything, and most of them don't expect to win. In the next chapter, we'll see how a rebellion turns into a declaration, how an impossible war is fought, and how the world's most powerful empire is challenged by people who shouldn't survive. Subscribe to Nexa Academy, because this is only the beginning